that's my phone saying it's time. Sorry about that. I'll let folks. We'll just go ahead and start the. Yeah, we'll just go ahead and get going. Good morning, everyone. Glad to see everybody on a Friday morning. We're winding down our week. I have the pleasure of having a guest from the Oregon Natural Desert Association, Jefferson Jacobs, here with us today. As this course has kind of evolved over the years, and especially during the pandemic, it's been obvious that we have the ability to bring people into our space that we wouldn't have normally had, or we've given ourselves permission to invite people in to share their expertise and their experience that has kind of been this insular, impersonal online course from the sense that there's not this dialogue and this interaction and where you can see one another and hear one another's voices. So it's a real pleasure to have Jefferson here, and it's so good to have you all here again. This is our second live webinar. We'll have one more next week. Just a reminder, that's next Wednesday at 10 o'clock. Erica Fleischman, the director of the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute, will be talking about climate change's impacts on ecosystems and some of her research and some of the things that their institute does. So don't forget to tune into that. Well, I won't take any more of Jefferson's time, but I just want to remind everybody that Jefferson is the Riparian Restoration Coordinator for ONDA, or Oregon Natural Desert Association. And Jefferson's hailing from Central Oregon in the high desert region. And this aligns well with our module this week on rangeland ecology and management. And just as a reminder, rangeland has that connotation for livestock, but the academics view that as an ecosystem and look at it from a multiple pronged approach. And Jefferson will share a bit about his perspectives and experience being in his position with ONDA, a nonprofit who emphasizes a lot of the efforts to conserve and do a better job of managing Shrub Steppe and rangeland ecosystems. So Jefferson, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for being here. I know you're busy, and it's great to have you.
Well, thanks so much. Yeah, busy getting ready for this presentation. I'm really excited to get to talk to you all. The Oregon Master Naturalist Program is a really amazing program that I'm glad exists. And I'm glad we have it in Oregon. So I really commend Jason and all the staff there, the hard work they put into it, because one of the most important things is to have educated and informed citizenry that can make their own decisions on things. And in the natural world, I think that's really critical. So I'm going to share my screen here real quick, just so you can look.
I'm sorry, I should have done this too. Just as a reminder, if you have questions throughout Jefferson's talk, please put them in the chat, and we'll get to those at the end of the talk. Sorry, Jefferson, I mean to.
No worries.
I mean to interrupt you there, but yeah, as you have questions, don't be shy and put them in there, and then we'll get to them at the end. So.
And I really welcome questions, because my strategy is to throw a lot of information out and have it kind of prompt questions, so then we can discuss that afterwards. So we'll see how that goes. So there, and hopefully now you are seeing the presentation view there, Jason. Is that good?
Yeah,
awesome.
It's coming in good.
All right, and I'm going to make you all a little smaller. And just quick background, I've worked for Oregon Natural Desert Association since the beginning of 2008, and I'm the Riparian Restoration Coordinator. So I lead volunteers on restoration trips in Eastern Oregon, restoring riparian habitat areas along rivers and streams. And we have kind of a unique approach where we work to enable beaver to have them restore these areas. But it's really fun work. So if you have any questions about that, let me know. But let me just get started before I even get sidetracked on my tangents that always come up anyways. So first of all, thank you again for the opportunity to speak with you all today. The Oregon Master Naturalist Program, like I said earlier, is something fantastic that I am really glad to be a part of. And thanks, Jason, for the invitation. I'm going to apologize in advance. I undoubtedly will use the various terms interchangeably of Eastern Oregon, dry side, Sagebrush Steppe, high desert. But basically, though, I'm talking about the landscape in the eastern half, or maybe even a little bit more than eastern half of the state, basically the rain shadow of the Cascades. Another quick disclaimer before I get started, that the presentation I am showing is full of amazing photographs that showcase Eastern Oregon, and none of those are mine. Those are all from ONDA's fabulous volunteers and people submitting photos for our calendars. When you see a bad photo in the presentation, though, that is mine. So I want to give credit where credit's due. And then before I even start, I do want to say that I understand that as part of the Oregon Master Naturalist Program, there's a volunteer requirement. And so if you do want to volunteer with ONDA, please let me know. I won't specifically go into the volunteer work aspect in the presentation, but would be super happy to answer questions about it afterwards. So just to reassure people that there is some sort of plan tying together what might seem like tangential lines of thought, here's the general roadmap of where we're headed. First, I want to do a quick general orientation as to what the word Mesic even means when people are talking about habitat, and touch on a little bit of how it fits into the bigger picture of the landscape. And this is going to be important to have in your mind going forward so you can picture the different scenarios and implications as I go on to what will seem like my first tangent in describing the concept of shifting baselines. And then from there, I want to talk about specific shifts and changes that have occurred to and within Eastern Oregon's Mesic habitats over differing timescales, and how those changes and influences can affect how we see Mesic habitat and guide our relationship with Mesic habitat today and in the future. Part of that will focus on the recent history of changes within riparian habitat, and that discussion will overlap with a description of kind of a rim-to-rim philosophy of watersheds. And then I'm hoping to leave you with enough questions and food for thought to consider the current and future state of Eastern Oregon's Mesic systems. But first, let's just quickly describe very generally what people may be referring to when they talk about Mesic habitat. So Mesic is basically just a fancy word for describing terrestrial habitat that has extra water or more moisture than the surrounding areas. So it could be riparian habitat along streams or rivers, or an area surrounding a spring or a seep where groundwater, filters down from higher elevations, hits a solid rock or some other impenetrable barrier, travels sideways, and then it pops out the side of a hill. Or people can use Mesic to refer to just a high elevation area where snow persists a little longer, and in this case, allowing a unique community of flowers to grow just because of that late summer persistent soil moisture. Mesic areas can also be seasonally flooded areas, such as the Eastern Oregon seasonal lake margins, or even the lake bed pastures in Malheur Refuge. But extra moisture can persist in the soil later through the growing season, creating mesic conditions also for some pretty subtle reasons in some pretty unexpected, otherwise really dry locations. This, for example, is a regenerating stand of aspen, and it only has enough water to grow here because it's located on the shaded north side of this rimrock, which allows snow to drift up and persist longer, but also gives it that cool shade so the ground dries out a lot more slowly over the summer. And some people look at this and say, oh yeah, it's a neat site for a spring. But this is actually at like the very top part of a little knoll, a little ridge, and there's no higher ground for miles around. It really is just because of that shaded effect. And really, to be honest, once you start seeing that shaded aspect pattern effect on vegetation, it's almost a pattern you could navigate by in many places in the high desert. For example, you'll find more mesic type plant growth, like these are chokecherry trees that are escaping cattle grazing up on these cooler northeastern facing cliffs. You'd find more of that there than you would on the hotter, drier cliffs on the exact opposite side of the same valley, because that opposite cliff is facing southwest, and that hotter, drier aspect you can see is really only supporting more like upland drought tolerant species like bunch grasses, cheatgrass, rabbitgrass, and rabbit brush and sagebrush. So just quick home on that turbo mesic tour of Eastern Oregon is that mesic habitat can take on a lot of very different forms, with many of them being fairly subtle and even just pretty ephemeral in some cases. But the other thing about mesic habitat in Eastern Oregon that's pretty evident in this picture here on the screen is that its presence on the landscape in the Sagebrush Steppe is more the exception than the rule. In southeastern Oregon, mesic habitats account for only about 2 to 5% of the total landscape. And yet 80% of the wildlife in the region depend on those habitats for their survival. And I'm not just talking about the typical creatures that you would immediately associate with wetter areas, but really almost everything out there benefits from these rare oases on the landscape. Not only because they simply need to drink water, but because of the unique plant communities that can grow there, or that grow more prolifically there. So those plant communities and the other conditions available only in mesic sites provide really otherwise unavailable food sources, or provide them at different times of the season when they're not available other places. They provide shelter and that unique seasonal timing, or things that are important like migratory stopover sites for birds or for butterflies. And that abundance has a bit of a snowball effect, in that the high primary productivity of plants leads to higher productivity and abundance of insects and animals feeding on those plants. And then on up the food chain to predators and that then benefit from the increased prey base. And beyond just the direct effects, the direct benefits of providing day-to-day food, water, and shelter needs for wildlife, the moisture in mesic habitat results in other important benefits. And that includes providing fire breaks and refugia for plants and animals during wildfires. This is a picture of beaver maintained riparian and mesic habitat after the Sharps fire in a dry sagebrush area of Idaho. but in a place that looks very similar to many places in Eastern Oregon. And you can see the beaver maintained habitat there along the creek didn't burn, but that area where downstream where it's drier and the beaver aren't or weren't, that area did burn. And then after fires pass through an area, those healthy mesic systems can provide even more benefits. In the case of beaver-supported mesic habitat, the beaver dams can fight the erosion and flooding that can occur when the fall and winter rains hit unvegetated hillsides. Because the moist soils of mesic habitat are less likely to burn or can insulate better from the effects of fire's heat, the vegetation will have a higher chance for survival within those oases during a wildfire, and it's then much better positioned to help reseed and recover the surrounding landscape post-fire more quickly. It's important to note that in mesic habitat, a lot of it is adapted to things like beaver browse and such. So as long as they have their sturdy roots, they can pop back up. But to protect those roots during a fire, that ground has to be wet. So that moisture that results in more plant growth in those areas results in substantial benefits in terms of carbon sequestration as well. In the case of beaver maintained habitat, the conversion of dry grassland habitat to mesic beaver meadow increased carbon storage by almost 35 times. So, but actually, and I mentioned this later in the presentation, so I don't want to get ahead of myself, which I often do. Before I get on to the next bullet point, let's do a quick review here. Mesic habitats are basically areas with some sort of extra moisture potential, and they can be really obvious, seasonally flooded area, or really subtle shaded exposures. In Eastern Oregon, they're as rare as they are important to the majority of wildlife species that depend on the unique conditions and plant assemblages that they provide. And mesic habitats play an important and beneficial role in larger regional issues like wildfires, or even global issues such as climate change and enabling animal migrations. So that means we get to move on to talking about the concept of shifting baselines and why this concept is so important for interpreting natural systems. This is a concept that even if I'm not saying it out loud constantly in this presentation, I really want you to have constantly in the back of your mind moving forward. So shifting baseline is a term that refers to the situation where, because sometimes conditions can shift so gradually, or because we're unaware of past conditions, that we basically assume that the current conditions are the normal conditions or the way things are supposed to be, or even more or less the way things have essentially always been. In terms of environmental degradation or planning or just understanding when you're looking at something, it's easy to see the implications of shifting baselines, and that sometimes we're more likely to accept or rationalize what may seem like a small amount of new environmental degradation because we're unaware of how much degradation may have already occurred. A lot of times this is exacerbated by each subsequent generation's inherited shifted baseline. And shifting baselines can also really lead to zealous and unwavering beliefs in ecological conditions that really are extremely hard to challenge or debate or even just bring up in conversation sometimes. So a great example of shifting baselines is the expansion of native juniper trees across the Eastern Oregon landscape. This is an area just outside of Prineville in Eastern Oregon. And because of shifting baselines, a person might think, and this is often what people think, that this is the way the landscape always looked. But because trees grow slowly, it's hard to notice a change from year to year, or even within an entire generation. And that means many are not aware that what is now closed canopy juniper forest not too long ago was sagebrush steppe. And without acknowledging that a change exists, it means not being able to consider the implications of such a change. And I think that challenging biases created by shifting baselines is really absolutely critical to discussions surrounding habitats in Eastern Oregon, in particular, for two reasons. Reason one is that Eastern Oregon in particular can appear to be a place where things are unchanged, where it's not hard to believe that what it looks like today is much what it looked like hundreds of years ago. So for starters, it's a geography that's really visibly defined by its geology. Rocky buttes, solid canyons, and really vast, wide open spaces. These are like solid, immutable looking landscapes. And even on a smaller scale, the high desert might seem timeless. You can go out into the desert and look down at your feet and see a 5,000-year-old arrowhead literally just laying on top of the soil as though it had just been dropped there yesterday. And you can see ancient petroglyphs and pictographs depicting animals that are still on the landscape. This is really a landscape that in so many ways can create the misconception of being stable, resilient, pristine, and unchanged, when in fact it is not the unchanged landscape it appears to be. So why is it important, especially important to think of shifting baselines in Eastern Oregon in particular? Reason two, acknowledging that these ecosystems have and can change allows for making informed decisions. But that first critical step really is acknowledging that the current ecological state has not always been the only ecological state. So ecologically, the past can inform our understanding of conditions we are seeing in the present, and then can inform options for potential future conditions. Understanding past conditions in history gives us a framework for addressing questions like in this slide, could we turn that dry gully into a fish-bearing stream? Well, it helps us to avoid squandering resources on fruitless goals and opens our eyes to other goals, which without the perspective of past conditions would really seem far-fetched or impossible. And I repeat myself a lot in this presentation, but to just drive this thought home, that this context of change over time and conditions, changing conditions over time, this context is so important for Eastern Oregon in particular, because without it, many of the recent and future ecological conditions really can seem absolutely unbelievable or absurd. Okay, so Eastern Oregon looks like an unchanged landscape, but it is not. And acknowledging that change has occurred is critical for allowing the discussions of past, present, and future of an ecosystem. But acknowledging the change is really only the first step. And to capitalize on this awareness, we need to have an idea as to what the previous conditions looked like, and then investigate what changed and why, leading up to the current state. And those data points will help guide prioritization and molding of our understanding of future potential conditions. And I like to talk about past ecological systems in Eastern Oregon based on three general timescales. And by three timescales, I'm not talking about past, present, and future. What I want to talk about are three timescales in the past. So to discuss the ecological past in Eastern Oregon, I want to break it down to three roughly defined chunks of time, each with its own conditions, changes, and implications. And you can think of these three past timescales in general as the geologic timescale, like is demonstrated by the climatic shifts illustrated by the various strata visible here at the painted hills. Second would be the most recent few millennia of the Holocene, during which we have the oral histories and archaeological record of indigenous peoples to inform us. And then timescale 3 would be the recent history of time spanning the days since European presence began in the Oregon territories. So let's start the furthest back in time. And I really like the painted hills because their strata are great reminders of not only how dramatically conditions have changed in Eastern Oregon, but also of how they've changed so many times over the geologic timescale. Each different colored layer visible here in the painted hills basically represents a dramatic swing in climate, precipitation regime, vegetation conditions, or a volcanic event. Each of those different scenarios over the past several million years left its mark by their changing soil chemistry, by leaving behind layers of fossils or deposits of ash. And so the painted hills are just a great reminder of the bigger picture dynamics on the landscape. In the more recent geological history of Eastern Oregon, in the early Holocene, in a time after the giant sloth bears, camels, and prehistoric horses went extinct in North America, the climate was continuing to warm up and dry out after that last glaciation. And many Pleistocene lakes were already gone or on their way out, but we still had lots and lots more water on the landscape than we do today. And while, granted, this was on the order of almost 10,000 years ago, it's recent enough that you would have recognized the plants and the animals, even if their distributions or abundance were different than they are today. And therefore, it represents a good place to start when thinking of when many of the current ecological foundations of Eastern Oregon were established. All I really want to get across with this idea is that not terribly long ago, Eastern Oregon had a lot more water, Mesic Habitat, and Mesic Habitat was therefore much more widespread, and then therefore much more interconnected, and that these conditions were present for varying degrees for thousands and thousands of years. But of course, thanks to wobbles in the Earth's axis and the vagaries of slight irregularities in our orbit around the sun, resulting in the end of the last ice age, Eastern Oregon's climate continued to warm up and dry out even further. This warming and drying resulted in not only the footprint of Mesic habitats shrinking yet further, but also in many cases, a shift in the Mesic habitat locations. So think of a Pleistocene lake slowly drying up over time and getting smaller and smaller until you're left with perhaps a seasonally occurring lake, or maybe even just a dry playa. And then picture as lower elevation conditions get too hot and dry, Mesic plants would become less common down low where it's hot and dry. But at the same time, those higher elevation areas, which had previously been too cold, would have warmed up enough to allow plants to colonize them. While all that's happening, of course, in some rare instances, some patches of Mesic habitat would be able to persist, left behind in kind of seemingly unlikely lower elevation locations where topographical conditions aligned and water was still present, thanks maybe to stream flows or to springs sourced from higher, cooler elevations. But basically, Mesic habitat in a lot of places was just escaping uphill and leaving some real relic remnants behind. And then, because wildlife, fish and insects had evolved to depend on those various Mesic plant assemblages, they follow the plants as they colonize their way uphill, as the plants follow the water and follow the tolerable ranges of temperatures and precipitation. So for visual folks like myself, sometimes it helps to be able to picture the process. So here is a lovely Pleistocene lake surrounded by nice green mesic habitat and fed by streams flowing down from surrounding snowy mountain heights that really catch the rainfall and where snow can accumulate in this closed basin. As the temperatures warm and precipitation regimes change, the lake in this closed basin shrinks. And the warming temperatures allow mesic habitat to colonize what were once inhospitable high rocky icy crags at the heads of those highest streams. The mesic habitat surrounding the smaller lake shrinks, and some streams actually now no longer have the water volumes to reach all the way to the lake anymore. More streams no longer reach their former mouths, and as a result, their lower portions just become dried out gullies, unable to support mesic habitat at all anymore. And the process continues until you're left with a dry lakebed playa surrounded by several hanging disconnected streams, some of which have shrunk to the point where you would more likely just kind of call it a spring, just a wet area on the ground. And some creeks have completely dried up entirely. And the reason I wanted to make you suffer through watching this really poorly drawn animation, is to drive home a couple of points. One is that when you start off with the conditions like this, there are two things to consider. One is that the volume of water and mesic habitat, it decreases over that process. And the connectivity between the various aquatic and mesic habitats decreases. The other thing that is important to note is that the mesic habitat had expanded basically as high an elevation as it could go. It kind of ran out of mountaintop at the head of the stream. And the reason I point these things out, the decrease in overall land cover and decreased water volumes, the reduced connectivity, and the elevation limits is to illustrate the inherent fragility of the situation that's arisen from the naturally occurring and irreversible prehistoric climate changes. When ecologists look at how to conserve an ecosystem or a species to make their situation less tenuous, less fragile, they're guided by the theory of island biogeography, which says, in part, that to conserve a species or an ecosystem type, that you need to maximize acreage, you need to maximize landscape diversity, you need to maximize connectivity between habitats and populations. And intuitively, this makes nice logical sense. A larger, more diverse landscape with room to move allows for more individuals to live there and for them to move or colonize different areas in response to changes or ecosystem stressors, such as fires or droughts. So suffice to say, these isolated reduced acreages, which have retreated in some places to the extremes of their geographic terrains or preserved by unique alignments of topography and hydrology, are by definition fragile. And just to emphasize this yet further, because these mesic habitats are smaller and backed into a corner geographically at the high extent of their creeks, any further changes or environmental stressors might really just be the straw that breaks the camel's back. It might be something even as simple as just the main precipitation source changing from snow to rain. These are really things to think about in the coming talk about climate change. Those habitats that are already really just hanging on by their fingernails will blink out. And unfortunately, because of the lack of connectivity, some of the flora and fauna associated with them might not be able to easily get to any other suitable habitat. I mean, fish, for example, would have a really hard time. In some cases, this isolation is extreme enough and has gone on long enough that unique genetics develop within populations at those isolated locations, making each one of those fragile systems even more special and unique. And because this is a concept that really defines a lot of what we're looking at and kind of the point that I want to get across, I want to talk about yet another way to visualize this situation, and that's with the idea of sky islands. And a sky island in Eastern Oregon would be typically a high mountain or butte that at a given elevation on its slopes would provide acreage containing a range of suitable temperatures and moisture conditions able to maintain a particular plant and animal community. In a cold climate, that zone of suitable conditions, I represent here by a green polygon, would occur low on the mountain, and higher elevations would be too cold and lower elevations would be too warm and dry. However, as the climate warms and dries, it results in a retreat of that nice zone, that Goldilocks zone of suitable conditions to higher elevations. And if it happens slowly enough, the associated plant communities could follow as it retreats up. They colonize the newly suitable elevations and escape the hotter, drier conditions below. But unfortunately, the further up you go, you can see as that green polygon shrinks a little, the less acreage that a mountain has. And then really in the end, mountains only go up so high anyway. And we lost that ecosystem on one of those little peaks, retreating up that peak. And it also makes me think of being in a house during a slowly rising flood. You know, first slowly you're backing up the stairs to escape the rising waters until you're on the second floor, then you're climbing out the window onto the roof and then up onto the chimney top, and then hopefully a helicopter picks you up or something. The problem is that these ecosystems don't have helicopters. Okay, so that maybe seemed like it was a little bit all over the place. So let me just do a quick review of the geological timescales and the related side tangents. Shifts in climate have occurred in Eastern Oregon for a long time. Since the end of the last glaciation, things have dried and warmed, reducing the amount of mesic habitat on the landscape and creating fragmented, isolated, and cornered patches at the height of those creeks, resulting in conditions which are inherently much more tenuous, illustrated by the concepts such as sky islands and the theory of island biogeography. Okay, so we've discussed the first of three timescales now, but rather than talk about the next two timescales individually and discretely, it'll sort of happen more all at once altogether. And in my mind, that sort of delivery is actually a much better representation anyhow of the interconnectedness of many of the scenarios and concepts that I'll go over. To do this moving forward, I'm going to narrow things down a bit, and instead of talking about all mesic habitat, I'm going to be talking specifically about riparian habitat. So areas along streams and rivers. I'm hoping, though, in your own further studying, that you can take many of the previous slides, concepts, and images and really apply them to the other forms of mesic habitat as well. I'll try to do this a little bit, but if I try and talk about absolutely everything in depth, it can get even more unmanageable. And feel free to ask questions at the end too. So let's talk about Eastern Oregon riparian conditions in the late Holocene. And by late Holocene, I mean pretty much about the time leading up to the first major European contact in the very early 1800s. Our records for this time include archaeological records, oral histories from the indigenous cultures living throughout Eastern Oregon at that time, and the journals and records of the very first Europeans to come into the Oregon Territory. ONDA actually just hosted a great presentation featuring Wilson Biwa, a Northern Paiute tribal elder, where he shares some of these oral histories describing the landscapes of the past. And I'm happy to pass along links to that recorded event if you're interested in watching. I really highly recommend it. What we've learned from the ecology and oral histories and old journals is that in 1800 or so, Eastern Oregon had a lot more water on the landscape than it does now, just a little over 2 centuries later. And as a result, it had a lot more Mesic habitat back then. Wilson Wiwa, the tribal leader that I mentioned, specifically describes visiting dry meadows in the Owyhee country that were once Mesic habitat, where previous generations of his family had gathered roots. And granted, I just spent whatever it was, 20 slides explaining how the climate has been warming and drying since the end of the last glaciation. But the thing is that since the early 1800s, we've lost much more Mesic habitat and lost it much faster than would be expected just by extending out that post-glacial climatic change that I was describing. Was this recent drying out the result of human-caused climate change? No, not specifically, not back then. It started too early for that. But humans definitely were behind the dramatic and rapid reduction in Mesic habitat and available water resources. And this isn't a trend that's limited just to Eastern Oregon. In fact, ecologists estimate that North America has lost 80% of its wetlands since colonization. Okay, so what is the series of events then that changed Eastern Oregon's riparian areas so quickly? Well, to start with, let's go back in time to the early 1800s when fur trappers started frequenting what was at that time referred to as the Oregon Territory. Because you see, at that time, felted beaver hats were a long-running fashion rage. And this is a felted beaver hat on the left. The fur trade supplying the demand for beaver pelts was so ruthless for hundreds of years that the original colonists quickly trapped out essentially all the beaver on the eastern half of North America. So in an effort to protect their last remaining abundant trapping grounds in Canada in the 1820s, the British-based Hudson's Bay Company intentionally trapped out, killed off essentially all the beaver in the Columbia River watershed and extending beyond of it. The idea was to create a dead zone to discourage American trappers that were expanding westward from trapping their way up into Western Canada. The Hudson's Bay trappers were actually so effective at eliminating beavers that it really only took them a couple of years to trap out hundreds of thousands of beavers out of thousands of miles of creeks. And just from this single devastating historical event, we can piece together a lot of what Eastern Oregon's riparian areas look like. The line of reasoning requires a very complicated mathematical model that I'll just walk us through slowly, but it looks something like this. So if you take the Hudson's Bay Company's meticulous records that show how many and where they trapped hundreds of thousands of beavers, and based on their own observations and their stated intentions, we know actually that in addition to all the beavers they recorded as trapped, that many more juvenile beavers, without the support of the adults, died as well as kind of collateral damage, intentional collateral damage. If we estimate a colony of beavers consisting of at least half a dozen beavers of multiple age classes living together, and we multiply that number of colonies by the 6 to 12 acres of habitat needed to support a beaver colony, or by half or 3/4 of a mile of river or stream territory, what you get is, and hold on a second, here are the three, actually, it turns out to be that there are basically beavers everywhere, and literally everywhere, on tens of thousands of miles of rivers and creeks. And that basically any and every creek throughout the region, except at maybe the highest elevations that are the steepest and rockiest sections, had beaver on them. And to have enough mileage to support that beaver population beaver would then have had to have occupied places that look completely inhospitable today. And this beavertopia situation and the population distribution is really what the trappers recorded as having encountered. Valleys in their journals were described as messes that were difficult to cross. In some places, they described situations where it was difficult to discern a specific stream channel because the valley floor could be covered in water and thick vegetation from toe slope to toe slope. These former habitat conditions, these habitat conditions required to sustain such a huge number of beaver are also right in line with what Native American oral histories describe. That such historic environmental conditions also explain how native fish populations, which depend on year-round cold water, could have survived so recently in widespread locations that are also now clearly so inhospitable. I want to pause here quickly to hearken back to earlier already in part of my presentation that may already seem like 3 hours ago, where I talked about shifting baselines and the interconnectedness of Mesic habitats just a few thousand years ago. Because what a lot of people say when they hear descriptions of such recent vast beaver occupations of inhospitable looking landscapes is no, or beaver weren't here, or no one's seen beaver living here, or I don't see beaver sign here. There'd have to be some old chewed stumps or something, or there's no way that this creek could have supported enough willow or cottonwood or aspens because the soil chemistry is wrong. There's too much ice scour. It's too dry. Besides, if there were big old cottonwoods and willow thickets, where are the stumps? So even if, there might have been 50 miles of stream, 50 stream miles of great beaver habitat along a creek with red band trout, and the creek ends in a dry playa. People say, well, how could beaver have even gotten here? These are all questions that I've been asked by professional biologists and land managers that I have a great deal of respect for. But hopefully I've given you a few ideas already as to some of the answers to these objections. But let me work through some, and let me answer this last question first by simply saying that beaver were already here because of the widespread conditions earlier. It's really a question of looking back through those various timescales. Beaver have been in the Oregon landscape for literally millions of years. During that time, don't you think that maybe there wasn't anywhere that they couldn't have gotten to, especially when things were more interconnected? But even on really short time scales, beaver are constantly proving that they can overcome amazing terrain and geographic and predatory obstacles to recolonize or to colonize new locations. Even now, over the course of the past decade, brave beaver pioneers, emboldened by the vegetation changes brought about by climate change, are literally climbing over the mountain passes of the Brooks Range in Alaska and crossing barren talus slopes and alpine tundra landscapes, surviving grizzlies and wolves and wolverines to start new colonies on the North Slope. How do they even know that landscape exists? So if beavers are doing crazy stuff like that on a time scale of just a couple of decades, I really find it hard to believe that over the course of millions of years, Oregon's beavers couldn't have just popped over from a neighboring drainage. Typically, the follow-up question when I talk about something like that is, well, yeah, but if there's so much great riparian habitat, where did it all go? I mean, where are all the stumps? And to answer that question, we need to take a rather significant and longer tangent into discussing beaver ecology. Because the thing about beavers and their habitat is that beavers aren't just passive beneficiaries of the habitat that they rely on. They create it and expand it and maintain it. And that's because beaver are what is referred to as a keystone species. That means that beaver are just like that top block, the keystone in an old Roman arch. The whole system depends on that keystone. And if that stone is removed, the whole arch collapses. In the case of beaver, the arch is the unique ecosystem that they support. And the way that beavers support, build, and maintain that ecosystem arch is by being ecosystem engineers. Beaver, as ecosystem engineers, need to maintain this arch ecosystem on creeks to create conditions that they depend on literally for their very survival. And they do that by controlling where and when water flows through the landscape, in part to provide safe areas where they can escape from predators. And they accomplish this by building dams, which slow springtime floods and bank water temporarily underground throughout the surrounding valley bottom. These tens of millions of gallons of water banked by a beaver colony irrigate a diverse riparian plant community, including a dynamic forest of willow, cottonwood, or aspen, species that beaver need for food and building materials, and that the creek needs for cooling shade, and that the wildlife needs for habitat. But as the close, convenient vegetation is harvested, beavers dig channels and canals throughout the valley floor to reach more distant vegetation, which further irrigates yet more land, creating suitable growing conditions for yet more vegetation. Because really just a narrow beauty strip of trees on a creek bank is not enough acreage to feed a beaver colony consistently. And that water that's banked in the spring and slowly and slowed down through the year has been actively cooled and cleaned by passing underground. And it leaks out during the warm summer dry season, maintaining flows as much as possible throughout the year. They need that to survive, escape from predators. It also provides the perfect temperatures for native fish when they need it most. And none of these processes can happen without beaver operating in their keystone roles. And this is a critical point. You have to have beaver in order for there to be beaver habitat. And if you have beaver consistently occupying a place, truly able to manage their habitat in a natural and meaningful way, then you will see the habitat represented by this ecological arch dominating that landscape. This is why I can say with such conviction, when I did that complicated beaver habitat math earlier, that if there were hundreds of thousands of more beavers on the landscape in the recent past, that it would have to follow that the landscape would have had to have looked dramatically different than it does today. Okay, with that beaver ecology background in place, let's go back to those conversations where people were adamant that beaver could never have had a meaningful presence here, or here, or even here. None of those photographs have big stands of aspens or willows to feed beaver. Two of those creeks actually photographed barely even had water. And where are those stumps? When people look at these places, they still wonder, how could this have been beaver habitat? So let's look at these very places a slightly different way. Here's our little ecosystem mini arch with beaver as the keystone, and alongside are two, poorly drawn representations of beaver habitat. And they correspond with what the landscape would look like given the state of the ecological arch. In the center of the picture is a bird's eye view of beaver habitat, and on the right is kind of a cutaway view of that same habitat. So with this tool in place, we can move forward through history from pre-1800s all the way to the present and track how things change. So before the beaver were trapped out of thousands of miles of stream, their habitat in the ecosystem arch would have looked like this. Diverse plant and animal populations were supported, and those resources were also key to the survival of local indigenous people living out there, Wilson Miwah's ancestors. Water was temporarily stored underground. You can see that to the right, and flowed underground, and water temperatures were cold. But then the beaver are removed. And very quickly, actually, things began to change. And we know this from the detailed descriptions in the journals of the very trappers killing off the beavers. Those trappers returned to creeks again and again to make sure that they had truly killed all the beaver, and noted that within just a couple of years after beaver were removed, that dams were no longer maintained and that ponds were draining. And as a result of this, there would be less water underground. And those side canals and channels dried up and filled in, and we lose yet more water. And you'll notice that the vegetation there in the center has been increasingly drying out and dying without that underground water to support it. And this huge land sponge may take a while to really drain, but once it does, it means water temperatures are less buffered from the summer heat, and smaller perennial streams are more likely to become seasonal streams. And by this point, we really have lost everything that made this area something you would actually call beaver habitat. Although it's still green and has some water, it is much more challenging for this landscape to support wildlife or those indigenous people. It's right about this point in history, however, when pioneers started showing up on the scene to settle land in Oregon territory. Their timing was pretty impeccable in some ways. They found these wide, comparatively fertile, recently drained valleys that were way better to farm and ranch on than the surrounding arid uplands. And so, to make those areas even more convenient for agriculture, those remaining streams were frequently straightened and moved to the sides of valleys. Remaining woody vegetation was often eaten by cattle or left high and dry by moving the creek, or plowed out to make way for fields. Large wood was valuable as a fuel source in the days when juniper were much rarer on the landscape. In many locations, this is when the General Land Office of the United States sent out land surveyors to look at and document the pristine, untouched landscapes of Oregon. Often these survey reports are misinterpreted today as representing pre-settlement conditions, when in fact they are often explicitly already describing overgrazed conditions and the widespread presence of invasive weeds. A straightened out stream bed increases a stream's water power by steepening the stream slope. It's the same scenario as if you were to go back and forth on a ski slope as opposed to bombing straight down. With more stream power and without any established streamside riparian vegetation community to hold the banks together, it's really the perfect recipe for quickly eroding the stream down to bedrock. And it's hard to have a stream store much water when it's down to bedrock. And really, you can see too, at this point, we aren't even losing parts of the ecological arch. We're kind of losing the geological foundation that the arch is built on top of. Add to that, because the creek is now way below the surrounding valley bottom, and it really serves as a drain, drying out that surrounding valley bottom even more. And so, over 100 years later, when beaver are finally able to try and start repopulating many areas in eastern Oregon, they come back to a landscape that's unrecognizable to them. Creeks that run dry with hardly any of the right types or amounts of vegetation, and where they still may be trapped for pelts or killed because of concerns about them damming up streams. But suffice to say, their arch is gone. The stumps are gone. Pretty much any evidence of this having once been thriving beaver habitat is gone. Because though I don't like sad endings, I will say that luckily I've seen multiple examples where if beaver are just left alone to do what they do, they are able to recover some habitats like that are in situations like this. Here's one example. This picture shows one of my favorite stops on the fantastic Beaver Dams of Eastern Oregon tour. This is Ankle Creek at Steens Mountain, and beavers moved into this area because of the remnant billows up on the old floodplains. This got to skip some of that, the farming impacts. The problem was, though, at this area that not only was the creek just a shallow trickle, but it was at the bottom of a 10 to 15 foot deep eroded ditch. You can see people there for scale. The beaver's solution, though, was to build a 12 to 15 foot tall dam. It really took them less than a couple of months to build this dam across the ditch. This is a view of that dam from downstream. Another thing that I like to do in situations where people still insist that beaver-related music plant communities could never have survived in a given landscape is to show them the few areas that are naturally protected from browse and from cattle by boulder piles, or where a few representative of old dead riparian vegetation does actually still exist along the former historic stream banks. It's just that now those stream banks are actually really far away or far above the current stream bank. Okay, let's shift a little bit here because it's easy enough to picture those various scenarios I just described impacting conditions on those streams, but how might beaver activity be related back to any of those other types of Mesic habitat that I first described earlier in the talk, hours and hours ago? Even I will admit that beaver can't be absolutely everywhere, but based on the situations that I was describing before, hopefully you can see that they could be in lots of places, and certainly a lot more places than people often give them credit for. Once you start thinking about the landscape a little differently through the lens of beavers and their ecosystem engineering, and keeping in mind the ideas of shifting baselines and changes occurring over different timescales, I'm hoping that you're starting to see the landscape in a slightly different light in general. But let's look at these various Mesic habitats and that are perhaps in some cases seemingly very unbeavery Mesic habitats and how beaver activities might in fact impact them. So let's start with the least beavery looking Mesic habitat that we find around snow patches or in the shade of cliffs. How can beavers do anything related to these? Well, these Mesic habitats are shrinking and drying out sooner each summer because of global climate change. Because of beavers' ability to irrigate larger landscapes and increase root growth and very large woody debris, they can increase the carbon sequestration of dry landscapes up to 35%, like I mentioned before. This helps fight climate change by reducing carbon in the atmosphere. Beavers' ability to create fire breaks and therefore potentially reduce the magnitude or intensity of wildfires also would be a beneficial thing to improving greenhouse conditions. In many situations, beavers' benefits are trickle-down effects. Because of beaver storing water high up in smaller headwater stream valleys, they help provide later season water to lakes and larger rivers that are further downstream at lower elevations. Storing water along a stream course also can provide connectivity between what would be an isolated perennial stretch and prevent dry sections that would block movements of anadromous or resident fish. And that water stored up high also may infiltrate into water tables that pop out as springs or seeps in what are actually some very distant locations lower down in the watershed. The trickle-down effects also come in the forms of improved water quality. Beaver habitat not only cools water, but it cleans it in part by forcing it to flow underground where it can be filtered, but also worked on by vast microbial communities. And by maintaining and expanding riparian forests, beaver also can provide quick-growing source of large woody debris that can get washed downstream. And large woody debris is a critical missing component of most Oregon river systems. So these upstream effects also have cumulative synergistic downstream effects, which can accomplish reductions in unnaturally dramatic seasonal fluctuations in water levels. These big fluctuations can kill off riparian vegetation in rivers and lakes. And without that stabilizing vegetation, it's the same situation as I described for small creeks. Erosion can result and water tables drop and surrounding vegetation changes. And while beavers admittedly aren't damming up entire large rivers such as the John Day, the Deschutes, or the Owyhee, they're still able to have direct effects on them by damming up small side channels back in those days when floodwaters regularly used to flow across extensive adjacent floodplains. And just like on small creeks, these side channels and dams would help irrigate large tracts of riparian vegetation. Beavers doing that stereotypical thing of cutting down large trees would directly add woody debris to those side channels and directly to the main channels of those large rivers. Beavers also burrow into the main river channel banks to create bank lodges, whose submerged entrance tunnels provide fish with refugia from floodwaters. But most importantly, what beavers can provide any watershed where they reside and are enabled to operate at full capacity is resilience to disturbance. It's the sort of resilience to disturbance that you can really only get from having a full-time dedicated maintenance team trained for thousands of generations whose very survival depends on their maintenance success. That resilience doesn't mean things will always look the same and never be a mess, but the changes that would take place would be the right kind of dynamic change that's in line with the species that are co-evolved to depend on that habitat. And what might be perceived by modern humans as a mess, because it isn't what we expect a riparian area to look like, shifting baselines, it is a mess that actually looks like fantastic habitat to wildlife. But I have to say that by focusing on riparian habitat and Mesic habitat just now, I have contributed to a narrow view of the landscape, which I've been working hard to encourage people to see past. And that is of not viewing a watershed on a rim-to-rim scale. I've got about 6 more slides to go through here. So it's fascinating to me that intuitively we know that a watershed is topographically defined by the theoretical route a drop of water would take after hitting the ground within a given landscape. Rain or snowfall in the Deschutes River watershed will most likely contribute towards the Deschutes River, not the John Day. Despite knowing this on one level, when we really roll up our sleeves and start talking about actions and impacts, somehow we narrow our views. For example, looking at this creek, people see the obvious Mesic habitat so clearly outlined by the greener areas immediately along the creek banks. And then it's almost as though they forget about the rest of the watershed acreage, that 99% that surrounds the creek area, which really occupies most of this picture off into the distance. Viewed in this narrower way, what happens outside this narrow strip of riparian area doesn't seem to have a lot to do with the creek. This view absolves us of or diminishes our responsibility to think of actions in this 99% area in relation to their impact on the creek. And too often this narrow view leads people to think of really a reduced set of solutions and scales of resulting benefits. Sometimes people will not even think of the impact of conditions immediately upstream or downstream within the riparian area that they're concerned with. Many times, though, what we see going on in a particular location is just a symptom of a root cause happening elsewhere in the watershed on what people typically refer to as the uplands. For example, what are the implications to Mesic areas of these hills changing from bunch grasses and shrubs to nearly closed canopy juniper forest? Maybe you've had the experience in Eastern Oregon of waiting out a rainstorm standing completely dry under a juniper tree. What's the cumulative effect of all those umbrellas on the landscape? What's the effect of replacing the annual water needs of a deciduous 3-foot-tall shrub with a 30-foot-tall evergreen tree? What's the effect of losing ground cover, such as fragile cryptobiotic crusts that allow for better infiltration of water into the ground, and replacing it with bare, compacted hydrophobic soil? If the limited water that actually does reach the ground gets evapotranspired by this new forest, or if that water can't infiltrate into the soils and it runs off the soil surface more easily and faster, how is that watershed scale upland landscape change going to affect the presence of water in Mesic systems in midsummer? What's the effect of managing the impacts on a watershed's ability to capture water inputs with tiny fences around spring outlets? I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see the fence there. Ironically, as good an example as this common Eastern Oregon Mesic habitat scenario is, with a spring protected by a little bikini of a fence, of how we undervalue the majority of the landscape and its relationship to Mesic habitat, it also demonstrates the exact opposite. The majority of Mesic habitat in the high desert is actually privately owned, with the surrounding landscape remaining public lands. It's a strategy of ownership that clearly demonstrates the understanding at one level that to control and benefit from the Eastern Oregon landscape, all you really need to own is the wet parts. It's kind of like an ecological demonstration of privatizing benefits and socializing costs. So here we are at the last slide, last tangent behind us, and here we are in the timescale of today at the end of a very long presentation. Thank you for paying attention. Hopefully you're all still there. The events of the past, whether they are natural and irreversible or the result of recent human activities, have combined in shaping the ecological landscape we have now. It's basically the hand we're dealt. But because of the knowledge of changes that have occurred to the landscape and the ability to determine cause and effect that led to current decisions, because we can tease out which sources of change we can alter and the ones we can't, those two things, that the path forward can be determined by our choices and actions rather than just by fate. We can choose the ecological status quo, we can choose to resign ourselves to continued degradation, or we can choose to commit to recovery. But it is just as important to realize that because ecological change is still ongoing, it's not a thing of just the past, especially in the case of human-caused climate change. Even not choosing an action represents a choice with substantial and impactful consequences. And here's where it gets difficult. Having a choice implies the implication of cultural, the application of cultural values and a framework defining our relationship with an ecosystem. And just as the ecological landscape has been changing dramatically over the past 200 years, so has the cultural one. What is the value of these landscapes, and to whom or to what? Eastern Oregon and most of the Western landscapes are almost nearly always referred to as rangelands. Just by calling these landscapes rangelands as a culture, we imply that their first, highest, and best use is range for cattle. And direct resource extraction has been the model for these landscapes since the first beaver trapper entered into the territory. But times have changed, and with them values and our understanding. And perhaps resource extraction techniques could be modified from those developed 200 years ago when our understanding of these systems and relationships to them were very different. Perhaps it can be acknowledged that decision-making for these landscapes can be shared with the growing percentage of people who prioritize Eastern Oregon's recreational qualities, its aesthetics, or for the solitude and open skies of the wide open spaces which have disappeared from so many other parts of the country. In this changing cultural landscape, is there room yet for recent cultural paradigm to honor and share the ecological landscape with the thousands of years of indigenous cultural history? Perhaps there's growing room in our cultural landscape to allow for a better acknowledgement of our relationship to our watersheds and our dependence on what are unaffectionately called the ecosystem services of wild places, things like clean water and flood control. And perhaps this cultural shift and evolution can allow for the consideration of the growing appreciation for the inherent rights of nature to exist and persist, regardless of our ability to point to a direct financial benefit to humans. when people doubt the magnitude, significance, or even existence of these changes in the cultural landscape, it makes me think of the biases we talked about with shifting baselines. So regardless of the scientific facts and the proven connections that can clearly outline the costs and benefits of a particular action, the truth is that the real future of these ecosystems will come down to weighing out options on the scales of our cultural values and seeing how they measure up against what we're willing to do, what we want. If I have one last message to give, it would be perhaps to take a page out of the beaver's book and learn a lesson from an animal with a brain the size of a walnut that has survived shifting landscapes for tens of thousands of years, because it realized that its very survival depended on focusing on the health of the ecosystems around it, with resulting benefits not just for itself, but also for all the organisms in that ecological arch that depends on them. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jefferson. That was truly amazing. And as somebody who sat through countless ecological lectures in university, I don't think it's ever been brought home as complete as that, and throughout all the through lines. So I appreciate that reminder for everybody else who's didn't have to suffer or benefit from a afternoon lecture on ecological processes or the complex mathematical models. Really helped. We have a fairly manageable group here this morning, so it might be just as easy to open up your mics and unmute yourself if you have a question. Kathy, you had a couple in the chat, but do you want to ask those on the mic or?
Okay. And thank you, Jefferson. That was awesome.
Oh, thanks.
My question was, you mentioned junipers and then you mentioned cryptobiotic crusts, and you kind of went through that quickly. And you mentioned water-phobic soils. And I'm wondering if the junipers are part of the problem creating that, interfering with the cryptobiotic soils and then creating the water-phobic soils.
Yeah, and gosh, that's like a whole nother talk in and of itself. When people come out to volunteer with ONDA, we sit around the campfire and I talk about this stuff. It's like a seminar all night long, and I just joke that people can go to bed once their heads are full, and I know I need to stop talking when there's no one left anymore. So I can tend to go on a little bit, but yeah, there are these individual path lines of ecological change that are all interconnected. So the juniper expansion changes not only what it's called intersection cover, what water actually touches the ground, but then what happens with it based on what the junipers do themselves, but then the trickle-down effects of what they do to the vegetation surrounding them. So junipers can have interception cover. They have roots that go outside, the lateral roots that suck up low infiltration water. They have deep roots that can suck up below the 60 centimeters that a shrub can get down to into more lower areas. But then since they're evergreen, they, whenever it's warm, they can start evapotranspiring, sucking up water and evaporating it out. So they can do that longer in the season than a deciduous plant would before it even greens up, because they're just there and ready. But because they have compounds in their leaves or needles, whichever you want to talk about, those it reduces competition from plants around them. So by reducing water availability and by changing with those compounds, the soil chemistry a little bit, it can reduce the amount of bunch grasses and shrubs and these other things. And if you think of bunch grasses as like little storm drains, they allow water to come down into the ground and infiltrate, because the inherent nature of most of the soils in Eastern Oregon right now is that there's not like an existing duff layer or something like that where the surface tension is light and water can trickle down through. They're this dry stuff. It's like putting a scoop of cocoa mix into coffee, it just floats on top there. Well, your mug of cocoa is upside down, so your rainfall just it's this waterproof thing. And when you're out in Eastern Oregon and there's a rainstorm, even a pretty heavy rainstorm, you go out and you just kick the dirt, and it's this much of it is wet on top, and then it is just dust down below. And so in that sense, if just junipers were doing their own thing, it would be one thing. But then they changed the plant community, which reduces how much can filter down. And by having, in some cases, fewer plants, then you're getting more of this dry exposed soil. But then you add on to that the effects of just ground disturbance. And so this could just be people walking along the landscape, or it could be the impacts of 200 years of grazing. And granted, in the past, that those impacts were a lot higher. You look at the stalking numbers for Crook County and such, and it's just like, oh my gosh, how, like, there had been cows standing on top of cows, and there were sheep, and there were horses, and it's just is really amazing. And so, granted, they're not that stocked that way right now, but the impacts remain. And so, cryptobiotic crust is this symbiotic community of fungus and moss and all these great things that just looks like an ooky layer on top of the, it's not particularly attractive, but it's amazing, that covers those dry soils, and it reduces the surface tension so water can filter down through. And also there's been things shown where it actually helps stop cheatgrass from seeding and all that sort of thing, but it's really hard to recover. People haven't figured out how to like grow it in a nursery really well without first harvesting it from somewhere else it lives. So all those things added together make it so that we just don't have a sponge absorbing this water. And so it rushes down the hill, rushes into a straitened creek with nothing to slow it down, and we're just flushing the system. It's perfectly designed right now for getting rid of water as fast as possible. So hopefully somewhere in there I answered that question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you.
Kathy, you had a follow-up about the horses in that photo. Maybe, I know this is a touchy subject, wild horses, or feral horses, I should say, more accurately. But they must have an impact on Shrub Steppe ecosystem, yes, Jefferson?
Yeah, and they do. Basically, you're on the most basic level, you're increasing the number of mouths to feed out there. And what ends up happening a lot of the time is wildlife gets the short end of the stick. So they're there, wildlife is there, but then it's also being used as cattle grazing. And then it's, a lot of the landscape is reduced productivity what it was before. So even if it was just wildlife, it would be a little touch and go just for them. You had cattle, but then wild horses are there, or feral horses are there all year round. And they're absolutely gorgeous and beautiful and amazing creatures. But having been they're just released horses. That's why they're called feral. They get kind of territorial and stuff, so they can find an important water hole in the landscape and defend it against wildlife and even cattle sometimes. And they also, since they have teeth on top and bottom, when they eat grasses and such, they can do a lot more damage to bunch grasses, the native bunch grasses, than other animals. And so it's a lot more of an impact. And again, just like juniper being around all year round and potentially sucking up water any time of the year, a feral horse needs to survive year round as well. Also, they don't have really any sort of predation on them, and that's significant. So their rate of increase is just, about 20% every year. And the landscape is finite. The landscape's resources are finite. And so that's why they talk about roundups and stuff all the time. It's not something that you just set once and can forget it, kind of thing. So
Thank you. Okay.
Thanks, Jefferson.
Worse than I thought.
Yeah, I think it's a much more complicated dynamic picture than just one story to tell about those interrelated impacts between horses and native wildlife and domestic cattle. And yeah, it's
a great example.
Yeah.
Great example of that cultural scales of what do we value? Do we value these gorgeous horses on the landscape and being able to see them, and they're inspiring, and many of them, like Kiger horses, Mustangs of the Steens, have great history and such. How do we value that and balance that against the impacts on other things? And again, you can have the scientific facts, and you can have these are the costs and benefits and everything, but it really just comes down to what we want.
Susan asked a question in the chat about that she understands there's a conference on restoring the beaver to distressed riparian habitats. Do you have information on this? And also, along with some other very kind remarks, thanks for this excellent talk. So they're showing up in the chat as well. So is there a conference that folks can get involved with, or attend, or tune into, or get the results from?
Yeah, there's a conference that happens every 2 years in Oregon, and that's a lot of kind of general beavery kind of content from around the world. Sometimes people come from England talking about the introduction of beavers there. That's usually on the west side. I can't remember. I think it's coming up this next year. I'm not sure. I've actually never attended myself, but I think it comes during the time of year when I'm often planting plants. And then there is River Restoration Northwest, which is probably hands down my favorite conference. But that talks a lot about riparian restoration and such, but not always like beaver things in particular. I would love to see a conference really focusing on beaver enabling restoration, because it's something that's really evolving. A lot of this has really snowballed, even just since the time I've come to Oregon, with Bridge Creek over on the John Day in 2009, where they started building things called beaver dam analogs that are basically human-built beaver dams to kind of jumpstart process of beaver recolonization. I'm actually giving a talk on the 16th that as soon as I get off this presentation, I'm going to run and start writing that one for the River Restoration Northwest Speaker Series that is free. And that's based out of Portland, that you can Zoom into. And I'm going to talk about how I look at the landscape in terms of restoration, enabling beaver to do restoration work. Yes, and I see somebody saying, I really enjoyed Eager with beaver with Ben Goldfarb, and I recommend that. Oregon Master Naturalist has a presentation Ben and I did as well. There's another book called Saving the Damned by Ellen Wohl, who's a fantastic researcher out of Colorado. That's part natural history, part beaver ecology. And then my favorite is Lily Pond, which is observation over several years of beavers in eastern United States. But the natural history, it's like Gorillas in the Mist, but with beavers. It's really cool, just constantly watching this beaver colony. So
yeah, thanks for the reminder, Jefferson. Jefferson and Ben did a co-presentation this summer during the height of the lockdown situation, where we weren't able to do field classes. So they're on our webinars link on the Master Naturalist homepage, if you go there to that. And I'll make sure to get those links to maybe to the Northwest, the River Restoration series, and the talk that you referenced that ONDA hosted with the Paiute elder. And so I can make sure to post those along with this recorded video of your presentation here, so everybody has access to that. I have just one. I know we're getting close to time, but I wanted to ask you, where you sit in ONDA, at ONDA, what are the attitudes of private landowners, ranchers who are looking at water availability and this notion of climate change? How is the presence or the notion of restoring beaver to those riparian areas? How is that being viewed by private landowners? Is there hope?
Well, yeah, there's like, I think there's tentative hope. There's definitely individuals that are expanding their views and acceptance, because what you're doing when you allow beaver to do things on your landscape is you have to give up a little bit of control. You are not mandating to this beaver. This is not a contractor working for you. This is an organism that's going to do what it wants. And there are some ways you can help guide things a little bit, but you have to collaborate. And a lot of times, landowners and managers are very used to being the ones in charge and telling things, and suddenly they're even on with these things. So with beaver, so I think people are gaining an appreciation in that. Okay, if I relinquish a little bit of control, I'm going to get these other things. And so you look at examples like Maggie Creek in northern Nevada and such that have relinquished a little control and had amazing results, where they were the only ranch in that area that had water during the recent droughts and such, because of allowing beaver to do stuff. So I think more and more people are understanding the costs and benefits a little bit better and making that reasoning. But it is still a bigger picture question and a long road to hoe. And that's why I try to do presentations and get the word out. I'm happy to share any of those other ones too. With the High Desert Museum, we did a presentation, and through our own High Desert Academy with ONDA, had yet another presentation that are always talking about these things from a slightly different angle. You'll see a lot of commonalities, but slightly different angles. So I can share those links as well. And there's things like legislative actions right now that are going on. There's a bill in the House that would remove hunting and trapping of beaver from national forests and BLM lands, but allow it on the other 32 million acres of Oregon, where it's private land, which is a state that's bigger than the state of Maine, where I grew up, and there's plenty of beaver trapping to go on there. And one that takes off the beaver's predation designation, which allows them just to be killed without any record keeping or any time of the year on private lands, but also is so poorly written in the game regulations that people confuse it with they can do that sometimes on federal lands as well. So that results in a lot of mortality as well.
Yeah, thanks for bringing those up. And as mentioned, there's a few requests for those links. And so I'll work with Jefferson to get those after this presentation. We'll exchange emails. I have some other things to follow up with him. I know you're busy, but we'll get those links posted in the course, and we'll remind folks where to go to find out more about learning, more learning opportunities through webinars and recordings and everything else. So, thank you so much again for taking a generous amount of your time this morning, Jefferson, and being a part of our learning process as master naturalists. And as you can scan the chat, there's been some very kind and grateful comments in the chat. So I appreciate, and I know everyone else has appreciated your knowledge and sharing that. So let's try to keep this going.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, it's taken a while to get connected to ONDA and this, but I don't want this to be a one-off. So let's keep going with this. And once we get back into the field, I know you and I are talking about this, but let's do this. Let's get.
Oh, it'd be great to have you all out
there in the high desert.
And working on some of these projects. And again, thank you for having me, and thank you all for actually engaging in learning about these systems and educating yourselves and being an informed public. That nothing can happen in the right directions. No discussions that are worthwhile can happen without that. So thank you for taking that important first step.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Jefferson. Appreciate it. And thank you all for being a part of this morning. It'll be recorded. You can go back and review it. And you'll hear back from me and as my weekly year-end my weekly weekly capstone email will come once I've had adequate time to review your assignments on the forest ecosystems and management module from last week. So, all right. Thank you all. Jefferson, you take care. Be well.
Thank you.
Everyone else. All right.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you.